The customer refused to pay the full bill, handed over half the money, and drove off like it was settled. Eddie stood in the open bay, watching the red Jaguar disappear, the unpaid invoice still warm in his hand. The man thought he'd gotten away with it, but the paperwork said otherwise, and there was no undoing that. The sound of that engine leaving stayed longer than it should have. Eddie stood by the open bay door, wiping his hands, watching the red Jaguar disappear down the road. The sun was brutal, white heat bouncing off the hood of a pickup, making everything look like it was shaking. He didn't move, didn't swear, just watched. The shop was quiet again, too quiet. You could hear the clock ticking behind the counter and the slow drip from a leaking hose near the lift. The smell of oil and burnt rubber hung in the air, thick enough to taste. He turned back toward the office, grabbed the invoice, checked the signature line. The guy had signed it, Grant Wallace. Neat, perfect handwriting. Underneath, the numbers looked smaller than he remembered, 4,870. Eddie sat down at the desk. The chair creaked. He picked up the phone, then put it down. What was he going to say? Hey, your payment failed, and you laughed about it? He let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but wasn't. On the wall behind him, his motto was painted in chipped blue letters. Fair work, fair pay. He stared at it for a while. It looked almost like a joke now. Outside, a truck horn blared somewhere down the street. He could see his reflection in the dusty window, tired, gray around the eyes, face lined from too many late nights. He thought about the soccer field, the noise, the cheering, his kid looking around for him. He reached for the cup of coffee sitting on the workbench. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. When he looked down again, the invoice was still there, the ink smudged from his thumb. Beneath the itemized list was a line he'd never really noticed before. Vehicle may be held or repossessed in case of non-payment per state mechanics lien law. He read it twice. Then again, the sound of the ticking clock got louder. He finally whispered, "Fair's fair." And the decision started forming, slow, steady, quiet. The garage was closed, but the lights were still on. It was past 11, and the air was heavy with the smell of metal and heat. Eddie sat at his desk, sleeves rolled up, a half-eaten sandwich sitting next to a pile of receipts. The radio hummed low, some old country song that sounded older than the building itself. He opened the drawer, pulled out the repair forms again, laid them flat. Each page had its own fingerprint of grease, time, and truth. He flipped to the copy Grant had signed. Bottom line, clear as daylight. The clause was there. Legal, simple, and cold. He didn't feel angry anymore. Just awake. Focused. He powered on the old desktop in the corner. The fan kicked up with a grinding hum. The screen flickered blue, then white. County website. Lien filing. He typed slowly, careful with every number from the VIN plate he'd copied earlier. Each click felt deliberate, like turning a wrench one notch tighter. Printer started churning out the forms. The smell of warm paper filled the air. He folded each sheet, pressed them into an envelope, and wrote the address with the same steady hand he used for torque specs. The night outside was still, the sky the color of burned steel. Eddie stepped out to his truck, envelope in hand, and drove to the post office. The town was asleep, only a couple of streetlights buzzing like old insects. He parked, dropped the envelope into the metal slot. It made a dull clank that echoed longer than it should have. He waited a second, eyes on the box, then nodded once to no one. Back in the truck, he didn't turn on the radio. He drove slow, window half open, the desert air cutting through the smell of oil and paper. At a stoplight, he caught himself tapping the steering wheel, almost like a rhythm. Not nervous, measured. He knew it wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was something quieter, something cleaner. By the time he pulled into the shop lot again, the sky had started to pale near the horizon. He unlocked the door, flipped the light, and the sign buzzed back to life. Open. 30 days. He marked it on the shop calendar in red ink, right next to a note about ordering new brake pads. Every morning, his eyes caught the same words. Wallace, 30 days. The heat pressed heavier each day. The fan groaned in the corner, stirring air that smelled of oil and dust. Eddie worked steady, polite, handing back keys, saying thank you like always. But each time he looked up at that calendar, the red ink seemed darker, like it was bleeding through the page. Grant never called, never emailed, just silence, the kind rich men are good at. One afternoon, while changing out a starter, Eddie heard the sharp hiss of the hydraulic press from the salvage yard down the road. It came in short bursts, metal giving way under pressure. He looked up for a second, listening. That sound felt close, too close, like a reminder of where things end up when people don't care. He paused for a second, hearing the creak of the lift settling behind him, like the shop itself was waiting. He wiped his hands and walked to the back room, opened the small metal box where he kept finished paperwork. Inside, the Jaguar keys were still there, dangling from a tag that read Grant Wallace, red convertible. He turned them once between his fingers. Then he set them down inside a folder labeled salvage hold and closed the lid. No hesitation this time. That was the moment, the quiet kind you don't see in movies, but the one that changes everything. The phone rang somewhere out front. He didn't move to answer it. The ringing stopped on its own. Outside, a dog barked, the press hissed again, and the world went on like nothing had shifted. But something had. Eddie went back to work, wiping his hands, checking the torque on a wheel lug, humming low under his breath. The rhythm was steady, almost calm. The countdown was over. Now it was just paperwork. The next night passed without a thought, like things might just settle. The morning started quiet, almost polite. The kind of heat that doesn't shout yet. It just waits. Eddie backed the flatbed truck into the yard, the red Jaguar strapped tight, shining under a thin layer of dust. It looked different now, not glamorous, not powerful, just metal with a bill attached. The guy from the salvage yard, a tall man with a sunburned neck, came out with a clipboard. VIN. Eddie read it off without looking at the paper. The man checked the numbers, nodded, signed, and said, "We'll process it right away." The air compressor kicked on somewhere nearby, and the sound felt heavier than usual. Eddie watched as the yard worker climbed into the small forklift, hooked the Jaguar, and rolled it toward the press. No crowd, no drama, just the noise of machinery doing what it was built to do. The car tilted, caught a bit of sunlight on the windshield, and for a second, Eddie saw his reflection, faint, distorted. Then the metal arms came down. The sound wasn't loud. It was deep, like the earth swallowing something whole. He didn't blink. He just stood there, hand on his belt, eyes steady. The operator waved. "Check will be inside." In the office, the air was stale and cool. A small fan rattled in the corner. Eddie signed the final papers, took the printed check, and folded it once before putting it in his pocket. He stepped outside again. The Jaguar was gone. All that was left was a flat slab of metal cooling in the sun. He took a deep breath, not proud, not angry, just even. The yard man called out, "You want a receipt copy?" Eddie shook his head. "Got all I need." He walked back to the truck, boots crunching over the gravel. The smell of hot oil and dust clung to his clothes. He started the engine, sat there a moment, and looked at his hands on the wheel, clean, steady, unshaking. When he pulled out of the yard, the press hissed again behind him. Short, sharp, final. For a day and a half, the shop felt lighter. Fewer calls, slower hours. Eddie even fixed an old truck radio, just because he could. Grant showed up 2 mornings later, angry before the door even opened. The sound of his shoes hit the concrete like gunfire, sharp, impatient. The sunglasses were gone this time. He pushed through the door, eyes already scanning the shop like he owned it. "Where the hell's my car?" Eddie didn't stand up right away. He was sitting behind the counter, reading a receipt book, pen tapping softly against the desk. He looked up, calm as a man checking weather reports. "You mean the Jaguar?" Grant leaned forward. "Yeah, the Jaguar. The one you decided to steal?" Eddie slid a small stack of papers across the counter. Each one stamped, signed, dated. "You didn't pay. I filed a lien. After 30 days, the car's mine. I sold it." Grant blinked, laughed once, dry, nervous. "You're joking." Eddie just nodded toward the papers. "County seal's not much for jokes." Grant's voice rose. "Sold it to who?" Eddie leaned back. "Recycling yard. They gave me what you wouldn't." Grant stared, mouth half open. No comeback, no angle left to play. Just air leaving his lungs slow. Eddie watched him, then added quietly, "You had 30 days. Fair's fair." Grant grabbed the papers like they were burning his hands, turned, and stormed out. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the tool rack. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the sound of the ceiling fan and the soft hum of the air compressor. Eddie exhaled slow, leaned back, and for the first time that summer, felt the air move easy again. He poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, the same burnt, overbrewed stuff that had been sitting since dawn. Through the open bay door, sunlight poured across the floor, catching the edge of the lift as it rose with another car, an old pickup needing brake pads. The hiss of the hydraulics filled the space, clean and steady. Eddie took a sip, watching the truck rise, metal gleaming in the light. Then he flipped the open sign back toward the window. He took another sip, eyes on the lift, the hiss filling the room. Justice didn't make a sound, it just held steady.